Hello, everyone. I am Elizabeth Corey, and I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And I am here to have a discussion about trauma recovery and how we can move on from all of these past experiences of complex trauma and really take our lives back, because we absolutely can do that. Even though most of the time our defenders are telling us that we can't, we can. And we're going to talk today specifically about one of what I would call one of the most popular defenses, mostly by the controller, that we probably have in our system. I would say it may plague the world in totality, as far as this is truly one of the big ones. And in a more general way, I would refer to this as an overactive mind, but it also has some more technical ways of looking at it, like labels, for example. Some people use words like ruminating, some people use words like obsessing. They all mean sort of technically slightly different things. But in general, the overactive mind is one of the biggest defenses. And I'll be honest, one of the hardest things for us to stop. Believe me, I know. I've been trying for a really long time now. And yes, I've made progress, but I will say that progress comes in little bits over a very long period of time. And that's just the unfortunate truth. When we grow up in an environment that creates complex trauma responses in our system, really having that overactive mind is just, it's the water we swim in, right? It's a part of dissociation. So it becomes what we know. Like, we don't know any other way of being on the planet, but living in a dissociative state with a very overactive mind. So changing that requires quite a lot of effort and a lot of persistence and not giving up and working and being happy with little bits of progress at a time, which ironically, the controller sort of fights against us breaking down this overactive mind by saying we're not doing it well enough, basically, is what they say. So it's sort of, we've got the controller coming at us from a lot of different angles, really. And it's important to know that. It's important to know that this is a long-term, right? This is a long-term strategy that we need to use. But having said that, we can make progress over time, like to where it's not like we have to get to a certain point before we notice that change is happening. Change will start happening along the way. We don't have to get all the way to this end point where we have no more ruminating mind to start seeing the benefits of working with the ruminating. That's my point, although I didn't say it particularly clearly. So let's talk a little bit about that overactive mind. And the word that I'm using the most today is ruminating. So this is what the mind does. But there is a way to overcome this defense, actually. And it's really interesting because we can actually use rumination and the subject of our rumination to help determine what is actually going on in the body that we can't reach. So we're actually using the defense to stop the defense. Somebody say to you, oh, well, you messed it up this one time, so you might as well give up. Again, that's a little bit of a trick. We do not have to give up. Let's talk about rumination, right? So rumination in general exists because we are avoiding the mind-body connection, okay? That's why it's happening. So when you are trying to sit still, even for 5 minutes, and I know this from personal experience, and you feel a ton of anxiety, and your mind is like, but you should be doing this and this and this and this, and you know, what about this, and what about last year when this happened? Okay, that is your controller attempting to not let you connect with yourself, connect with that body while you are sitting still for that 5 minutes, which has a tendency to be the amount of time we will allow ourselves to sit still on average, right? So that, just the existence of that overactive and ruminating mind already tells us, right, that we're avoiding a mind-body connection. Now, we don't necessarily know why, It could be that there are emotions that are unprocessed. It could be that there are memories that need to come up, but in general, the body is almost always trying to communicate with us about what it's holding on to, usually from the past. And the controller is trying to block that by keeping the mind so busy that we cannot even begin to hear what that body is saying to us. So if you have lived with an overactive mind, I will also pretty much guarantee that you've also been telling yourself that everybody does that. And the truth is that, yeah, almost everybody does have an overactive mind, right? It is sort of a plague of human existence, but that's because everybody is running from themselves. It's like we have this habit of being like, oh, well, because it's common, that makes it okay. And this can be a problem with us in recovery. Because no, just because everybody's doing it, that doesn't mean that it's the best way to live on the planet. Like it doesn't make it good for us, right? So this is something we have to kind of question ourselves about as often as we can. Just because something is happening and we see it happening in everyone, and just because somebody says to you, oh yeah, I have that same problem, I'm always thinking about things, I can't quiet down my mind, that doesn't make it an okay thing, right? We can still work towards something better. So that can be a common defense in us to kind of say, oh, well, everybody does it. So it's just, it's just human. It's just being human. That's what we have to live with. That's the deal. We have to live with this No, we don't. The existence of rumination says there is something in the body we are running from. So that's the number one sign, and probably one of the most important signs to learn, right? But now I want to talk about some of the nuances, some of the subtle things we can pick up on when we are ruminating. Now, this will require us to pay enough attention to notice what we're ruminating about. I'll be honest, sometimes we can just feel really, really angsty and agitated and uncomfortable and not present, and we don't even know what the mind is doing. I'll be honest, we don't always know. But the more we practice this kind of watching our mind and seeing what our mind is up to, the more we will start to pick up on what it's doing and what it's saying. And that's really a big part of what we're trying to do here, is we want to kind of get that cycle moving by watching and then being able to see and figure out what it's about, and then watching some more. This is really the most basics of awareness. Yeah, it's a mind of its own. Yeah, I mean, honestly, our mind is largely run by just one part of us, okay? That's this controller part I keep speaking of. It is not the entirety of who we are. It's actually a very, very small part of who we are. But in our very controller and mesh society, we put all of our focus on the mind as being the primary kind of feature of human existence. It's not. It is just scraping the surface of who we are as humans. And yes, we hear this a lot from sort of more spiritual kind of angles, but when you start to become aware of rumination, you are already separating yourself a bit from the mind, just bringing in that awareness. Because if you are aware that your mind is doing something, and that means something other than your mind is aware that your mind is doing something, and that's a great thing. That's what we want. We're trying to build that understanding that there is something so much bigger than the mind. I refer to it as the grounded adult self, but it's so much bigger than the mind. And our capacity to perceive our world is so much bigger outside of the mind. And yes, you may have heard all of this before, but you also may have been like, well, that's great. I don't know how to reach any of that. And that's sort of where I come in, because I can bring some of the practical steps that we need to start building that connection to that thing that isn't just the mind, that is us, right? That's what we want. And sometimes I find that the spiritual texts that talk about this idea don't really give us a lot of clues about how to get there, how to get to that, whatever that thing is. And so that's what I really want to do with this work here. And that's where the emotional journaling comes in so much. So Rebecca is saying, my mind can't handle stress anymore. I lived under an extreme amount of stress most of my life and functioned very well through it for years. However, once everything started calming around us deliberately, good job on that, my brain set its limits. I now can navigate it better. Yes. And most of the reason why we run like that, again, we're trying not to connect to the body. But when we're younger, we have this very strong controller. Controller is off the chain. Like if you're in your 20s, it's very hard to consider doing this kind of work. You may do it on some kind of surfacey level, but it's really hard. Most people don't start to be able to kind of get underneath that controller energy until they're a little bit older, because when we're younger, we have so much energy, even with trauma. Like I remember in my 20s, I had so much trauma. My body was in pain, but man, I just had enough energy to keep pushing. And I did in ways that were not healthy for me, but I did it anyway because I could. Usually as we start to get a bit older, the controller starts to drop as far as its effectiveness, and some of the other parts start to show up. The body starts communicating more. And then we're like, what's all this? And it really does change our perspective and change the way that we're living in the world. Controller and mesh society would say, well, now you're not as productive, whatever. So we start to hear messages like, oh, I'm less valuable. But really, you're just getting started when you stop letting the controller run your life. Because my gosh, can you do amazing things when you're not just running from that one part, as I've been saying. So let's talk about types of rumination and what we can actually do here with it. Like what kind of awareness can we build? So the first type of ruminating I want to talk about is when we are ruminating about bad things happening. Now, usually in this case, we're ruminating about things that are bad that are going to happen. So another shoe is dropping, right? Or is going to drop. Like things, not doing things well enough to avoid problems, right? Like I can definitely, relate to this one. This one is a big one for me. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not being preventative enough. I'm not watching carefully enough. I'm not being hyper vigilant enough. I need to put in more effort here. I need to avoid these problems. If I'm not constantly focusing on these problems, they're going to happen, which is unfortunately kind of the opposite of what actually happens. And so this kind of rumination what it's telling you is that your controller's fears are running the show, right? So in these moments, the controller is like, oh my God, bad things are going to happen. You're not being hypervigilant enough. They're trying to keep you focused on avoiding problems that may or may not even exist in the world, instead of kind of connecting with yourself. Those fears are real, but they're actually not about the things you're ruminating about. The fears are about other things, usually things from the past that are being projected onto your current life, okay? The controller believes that your survival is dependent upon the hypervigilance of the controller. And it may be that when you were younger, that hypervigilance did pay off for you in some ways. Okay, I'm not saying that it didn't, but it doesn't generally serve you as an adult to be that hypervigilant. As a matter of fact, when we are present and in the body, we are far more aware and intuitive than we can ever be with just the mind by itself. The mind is powerful, don't get me wrong. A lot of smart people in the world, they do a lot with the mind. But honestly, that grounded awareness and intuition serves us far better to avoid problems in our lives than the mind can really do for us. So, but if the controller keeps you up here, the controller stays in charge. That's really important to them. So that's what they're trying to do. So if you feel yourself spinning or ruminating about trying to avoid problems through hypervigilance, that's your controller's fears. It also can be, it's still the controller, but it can be a response to the karma kid underneath the surface saying that we will be punished for something. Usually when the karma kid activates in that way, it's because we are doing something for ourselves. We are taking a new step in our lives that maybe the karma kid thinks we're not allowed to do. There can be a lot of reasons why the karma kid steps forward, but generally in rumination, you will be hearing from parts who are responding to the karma kid. They're not the karma kid that actually does the ruminating, but the karma kid is sort of underneath that. And it can be really good to see that, because as we write from these kind of messages, we can start to connect more with the karmic kid, who is usually the one who's wreaking a bit of havoc in our lives. So it's a good thing for us to get in touch with that. So the next type of ruminating I want to talk about is going to be similar as far as the parts that are players in this, which is ruminating about justifying our actions. If we find ourselves going over a situation again and again and again, sometimes I refer to these as spin cycles too, right? What we're doing there is we're in a conversation. We have a part that's having a conversation with another part. Usually the controller is justifying and defending our actions in that situation, because the karmic kid is under the surface saying we're to blame for it, or we're bad, or we did something wrong here, because that's often what our karmic kid has been trained to say. Again, we often don't hear the karmic kid. We hear the controller, but the controller is responding to the karmic kid. And so what seems like just a spin cycle of thought is actually a conversation where we are only getting half of it, right? So when we start to recognize that the controller is ruminating and justifying something, it can allow us to see that maybe somewhere deep inside of us, we're giving ourselves a bit of a hard time. We may be blaming ourselves in ways that we don't even hear that we're blaming ourselves for. So again, these are these clues we can use when the ruminating gets going to provide information to us about what we might not yet be aware of in our inner conversation. That is very powerful, right? So the next rumination I want to talk about is ruminating about how we got something wrong and we should have done it differently. Now, this may be one time where we are getting a little bit of that karmic kid self-shaming through. Okay. And we can actually hear that. And if you're someone who can hear your own self-shaming pretty well, you may get ruminations like this, where you just feel yourself going over and over and over again in that spin cycle about how you did something wrong, or even looking for something that you have gotten wrong, which again indicates the shame, that shame of the karmic kid is present. But you may only be hearing the controller's version of it, which is going to be a bit sort of numbed out, dumbed down, not quite the level of self-shaming we're actually doing. It's going to be more naggy, as opposed to the self-loathing that can often exist with the karmic kid under the surface. So again, if you feel yourself nagging yourself about how you've done something wrong, that may be pointing to some karmic kid shame under the surface. Now, the controller will not make it easy to get at that. But at the end, I'm going to talk about how you can start to connect with the controller around this rumination, so you can begin to get a sense of what's underneath it. Okay. So the last rumination I want to talk about is something I call daydreaming rumination. Now, it can just be daydreaming. I mean, lots of kids do daydreaming, and usually that's because they don't really want to connect with themselves fully either, right? But adults do it too. And this can be several parts that are at play here, okay? One way we may daydream is we may find ourselves daydreaming about answers to our losses. For example, we may daydream about finding the perfect partner, or finding the perfect friend, or finding the perfect mother replacement or father replacement, or whoever. We may just start thinking about being a part of a group that makes us feel that we belong, right? Okay, these are all sort of signs and symptoms that the love seeker is under the surface looking for ways to find answers to their losses in the external world. Now, oftentimes, though, we're like with the karmic kid, we're not getting a clear love seeker there. It's a little bit, numbed out, dumbed down. We're not feeling the grief of the love seeker, which is difficult to get to. That controller is sort of keeping it at a certain level where it's acceptable and letting the love seeker play out these daydreams as a way of kind of hoping to keep them from needing to feel those feelings. In the end, the controller's rumination is always about not feeling feelings. I mean, that's why we do it. But the love seeker's grief is a big no-no by controller standards, just like the karma kid's shame and futility. So they will let you spin on daydreams for days. I mean, days and days and days. As long as those feelings are a threat to the system, the controller will sort of let that keep going. And yeah, we can lose a lot of time on these kind of like, I'm going to find the perfect this or the perfect that to make all of my losses go away. And that is a love seeker thing. But there's other ways in which we might daydream. It's not all love seeker. We can also daydream, in a sense, from the controller as they try to solve problems that are current by redoing something in the past. So it's like, if I could redo this, if I could find another solution, if I had found another solution 10 years ago or 15 years ago, this can also feel a bit like regret, like I wish I had done that then, or I wish I had done this then. But underneath that, we can see that, again, the controller is responding to that karma kid shame and futility that says, you know, all is lost because you're not good enough, or all is lost because you didn't do the right thing before. And that keeps us stuck in that daydreamy loop that says, if 10 years ago I had done X, then everything would be okay. All right. And so these are some of the ways we ruminate. Now, I'm not going to begin to suggest that this is all encompassing. No way is that true. But it gives you a sense of maybe some of the things that your mind might be up to. And what sort of is that little river that's flowing down underneath that rumination that is really helpful to be aware of. And Carol is saying, KK, Karma Kid and Controller are a powerful tag team for sure. They really are. When they are coming at you together, and I'll be honest, a lot of times they are, because the controller gets really active when the karma kid is active. So they're trying to block it, right? Like with this rumination. It is a very hard defense for us to get past. And it's why this awareness work that we're doing is so helpful. Because if we don't see it, we won't be able to really do much about it. I mean, that's just the truth. Let's see. Nadine is saying, you help me connect the dots and the parts of me that I try to figure out. Makes sense. I appreciate you. Thank you. I'm so glad that this is helpful. I will say that it can be quite the long journey to figure this stuff out. It's not easy at all to figure out, but it is possible. And I'll be honest, sometimes with that futility in the karma kid, it can be hard to think that it's possible sometimes. So what do you do with this rumination, right? You're like, okay, Elizabeth, you told me what to look for. Now when I see it, like, what then, right? Like, how do I address it? So the first thing is going to feel like an absolutely impossible task. And to a degree, it will be for a little while. We want to take a break. We want to break the rumination and pull ourselves back into the body. Now, when we first start doing this, we will be successful for 5 to 10 seconds. And that is not an exaggeration. That's how long you'll be able to hold it. Okay. Now, I have this phrase that I use. I say, thank you, controller, but I'm not going to think about that right now. And then I bring myself back into the body. My favorite way of doing that is what I call breathing into the feet. Now, obviously, I'm not really breathing into the feet because that's not a thing, but I'm focusing on my breath and my feet at the same time. Not changing the breath, just noticing it and my feet. Something about that gives me the sensation that I'm breathing into my feet. And when I do that, I come into my body. Again, mind just saying nope and bringing myself down. On any given day, any given moment when I am ruminating, again, I may hold that for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. That's a win, by the way. That is a win. I want to be very clear that that's a win. This is very, very hard to do because controllers can be very adamant about not getting into the body, and they will fight. For us, this is something we're doing to become healthier and to live a better life. The controller believes that they are doing this for life or death reasons. So you can imagine the level of desperation they feel. However, I will also say that over time, they can't fight against this. It is in your nature to be in your body. It is your nature, and you are very driven to get reconnected to self. And really that's what the universe supports. So what the controller is fighting against is going to, in the end, be too big for them. But we can give them compassion and understand how scared they are along the way. And that is a very helpful thing as we do little bits of this, just little bits, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, you're making a difference. And then you can do some writing from the fear of the controller. This will help us start to get more connected to that karma kid energy or the love seeker energy that is often below the rumination. So that controller writing may look, it will definitely be fear. And it may sound like, stop what you're doing. Don't connect with the body. You can't handle what's there. You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the emotions. We're going to end up just completely overrun with emotion to never function again. This is going to be a disaster. These are, my controller doesn't want me to say that. These are very, very important things to start writing from when we can, from that controller. So let yourself do that. Let yourself hear from the controller while you get a little bit grounded, even for moments at a time. And you will start to see a little more space between you and the mind. And this is key. We want a little bit of this understanding that there's there's a being that is an adult self, and there's the mind being run by the controller at the moment. And those are two different aspects of self. That's what this work starts to build for us. Okay, so give this a try. Again, every single time you do it, it's amazing. It's a win. You are already doing something that 99.9% of the population has never tried. So congratulations for doing it, even for a few seconds. Okay, give yourself that pat on the back every time you try it. So, boy, my defenders are messing with my throat. They do not want me talking about this. So thank you all so much for being here today and for listening to me as I talk about this really, really hard thing. And that shows me that you built a lot of awareness already. So, because the controller hasn't made you click leave on this live stream. I actually don't know what it says for you, but that button, that button in the right corner. So, thank you all, and I will talk to you next week. Same time, same place. And feel free to email me anytime that you have questions about these live streams or you want to talk with me more about how this works and how we do this. Because honestly, it's one of the most important things we can be doing for ourselves. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I will talk to you next week.